Okay, let's get into it. When you think of Victoria, Australia, your mind probably jumps straight to, the MCG, the Formula One race, or maybe those old stories about the gold
Oh,
rush.
for sure. The big flashy stuff.
Exactly. But our mission today is to go way deeper than that. We're doing a deep dive into what Victoria is really about. A state that's, well, it's historically rich, geographically complicated, and it's defined by this fascinating paradox.
And that paradox is everything. It's the key.
It is intense population concentration on one hand, and this massive, and I think you'd have to say sometimes painful, economic shift on the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're looking at Australia's second smallest state by land area. It's a pretty compact 227,000 square kilometers, roughly.
Tiny in Australian terms.
Right. But, and this is the kicker, it manages to be the second most populous state. We're talking an estimate of over 7 million people as of September 2024.
And the simple math there means Victoria is critically the most densely populated state in Australia. It's about 30.6 people per square kilometer.
And that density isn't just a number on a page, is it?
Not at all. It dictates the whole speed of life, the complexity of the infrastructure, and definitely the character of its politics.
Exactly. That kind of concentration is just it's unusual in a country that's defined by these vast, empty spaces. It really explains why Victoria feels so much more urbanized than a lot of its neighbors.
And just for the record, geographically, it's sitting right there at 36 degrees south, 144 degrees east.
And the crucial part, the capital, Melbourne, is where nearly 70% of those 7 million people actually live. It's all concentrated.
We should probably also touch on its nicknames. Most of us probably remember the old car license plates that called it the Garden State.
Yeah, which points to its parks and, those lush regional areas.
But its newer, more official moniker is the Education State.
And that is such a powerful signal of its modern economic priorities. It's all about its massive university sector, which, we'll definitely get into later. It's one of the state's biggest export engines.
Right. But despite all that high-stakes, fast-paced, modern economy, its formal motto is still very old school.
Oh, yeah. It's firmly rooted in history, peace and prosperity.
Okay, so that really sets the stage. To understand this modern urban powerhouse, we absolutely have to start with the deep history. I don't think you can grasp Victoria today without appreciating the scale of its ancient past and, of course, the disruptive force of the gold rush.
Let's jump in. And what's fascinating here is just how deep that history runs. We aren't talking centuries. We are talking about a documented human history in Victoria that goes back something like 40,000 years.
40,000. That is an immense scale. And this involves multiple Aboriginal nations, the Wurundjeri, the Gunai, the Gunditjmara, who weren't just passing through. They developed these incredibly complex societies.
Yes, and that complexity includes a detail that I think often surprises people.
Yeah.
People who assume pre-colonial Indigenous life was purely subsistence-based.
Right.
Early Indigenous Victorians were noted for farming eels.
Farming eels. That's incredible.
It is. They were practicing sophisticated aquaculture, managing complex waterway systems and traps. It suggests a highly organized, semi-nomadic existence based on hunting, gathering, and this really specialized form of fishing.
That speaks to a sustained, intentional management of resources, not just, chance. So what's the aha moment, the specific archaeological detail that locks this deep time frame in for us?
That would have to be the Keeler Archaeological Site, which was discovered near Melbourne. Back in 1971, excavators found a human hearth.
Okay.
And it was scientifically dated using radiocarbon to about 31,000 years before present. So this makes Keeler one of the absolute earliest confirmed sites of human habitation anywhere on the Australian continent. It just firmly establishes that antiquity.
And what's even more remarkable is how that deep past is preserved in the oral traditions. It's not just in the ground.
It's an incredible synergy between cultural memory and, hard geology. The creation stories of the local Aboriginal nations, specifically from the Wadawurrung, Werewurrung, and Bunwurrung languages, they have these detailed narratives that describe massive geographical changes.
They talk about the land being flooded.
Exactly. They speak of a time when the land they knew was flooded by the rising sea.
Which is the end of the last ice age, right? When sea levels rose all over the world.
Precisely. Their oral traditions describe the flooding of Port Phillip Bay, which modern geologists confirm happened somewhere between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago.
Wow.
And these stories confirm that what is now Hobson's Bay, near Melbourne, was once dry land. It was a celebrated kangaroo hunting ground. It's just a remarkable cultural record.
So then when we transition to the British story, the motivation for their arrival was, well, it was less about settling the land and more about just pure territorial anxiety.
Totally preemptive. The British were genuinely worried that the French, who were actively mapping the southern coast, might just swoop in and claim the area first.
So the first settlement in 1803 at Sullivan Bay was a get-in-first move.
Pretty much. And it was a temporary settlement, only about 402 people. And here's that sobering detail again. The majority of those first arrivals were convicts. So it was a military outpost, driven by geopolitics, not opportunity.
And the area stayed as the Port Phillip district of New South Wales until 1851. That's when it was separated from NSW and formally named Victoria.
In honor of Queen Victoria, yeah.
Yeah.
She was 14 years into her long reign at that point.
And almost immediately after that separation, we get one of the most fraught moments in the colony's history, the Batman Treaty of 1835.
This is a really complex one. So John Batman, who's often called one of Melbourne's founders, he tried to negotiate a land use agreement directly with the Wurundjeri elders.
Right, offering them goods and rations, blankets, axes, knives, in exchange for access to their land.
And this raises a huge question about colonial history. I mean, what was his intent? Some sources frame it as this significant, if maybe deeply flawed, attempt to gain land by agreement rather than just taking it.
Which would have been a real outlier for the time.
A huge outlier.
Yeah.
But others, I think rightly, argue that the power imbalance and
Yeah.
the value proposition, offering trinkets for vast, invaluable territory, it just makes the whole thing a pretext for appropriation.
And regardless of what Batman himself was thinking, the colonial administration's response was swift and definitive.
Oh, yeah. The Crown later just declared the treaty void.
Hmm.
The legal justification was simple. Batman was a private citizen. He didn't have permission from the government to make any kind of agreement or to recognize Aboriginal land title.
So the land was just claimed unilaterally. It reinforced that principle of terra nullius, land belonging to no one.
Despite the clear presence of these ancient, complex societies.
Okay, but if separation from NSW gave Victoria its name, one singular event completely transformed it into the powerhouse we know today.
Gold.
The discovery of gold. The gold rush era, starting almost immediately after separation in 1851.
It was an absolute explosion. Gold was found near Ballarat and Bendigo, and the effect was just immediate and dizzying. We've talked about population density already, but look at the speed of the growth.
It's insane.
The population increased sevenfold in just 10 years. It rocketed from 76,000 in 1851 to 540,000 by 1861.
And that kind of migration isn't just local, it's global.
No.
So who is flooding into Victoria?
People from everywhere, driven by this promise of getting rich quick. There was huge migration from Ireland after the famine and, crucially, from China.
Right.
By 1857, census records show over 26,000 Chinese miners were working in Victoria alone. So this created this vibrant, complex, and sometimes tense social environment that really laid the foundation for modern multiculturalism.
And the output numbers, they justify the frenzy. To call it the richest shallow alluvial goldfield in the world? That's a staggering claim.
The statistics are mind-boggling. Between 1851 and 1860, Victoria produced 20 million ounces of gold.
20 million.
That volume was 1/3 of the entire world's gold output during that decade. This sudden, immense wealth, it financed the infrastructure, it built the grand architecture of Melbourne, and it cemented the state's position as the financial center of Australia for decades.
But, that kind of rapid, unregulated wealth and mass migration, it inevitably leads to friction. Which brings us to the famous Eureka Stockade in December 1854.
This wasn't just gold fever. This was a political awakening.
Yeah.
It was a conflict born of, systemic corruption and unfair taxes. The government imposed these heavy mining license fees, which were collected aggressively by police. So you had these widespread grievances about the licensing, the corruption, and a total lack of political representation for the miners.
And the Eureka Stockade was the armed rebellion that was sparked by all that.
It was. And it was swiftly and violently crushed by British troops. There were casualties on both sides.
So if it was defeated, how could it be so transformative?
Because it fundamentally shifted the political landscape. The crushing of the rebellion created huge public sympathy for the miners' cause. It forced the colonial authorities to bring in significant reforms almost immediately.
Like what?
They abolished the unpopular gold license fees and replaced them with a much fairer, cheaper miners' rights. And crucially, they also extended the electoral franchise, giving the diggers a voice in the parliament.
And what's really fascinating is that the rebels weren't, exiled or executed.
No. Some of the actual leaders of that rebellion, men like Peter Lalor, they were acquitted, and then later they were successfully elected as members of the Victorian Parliament.
That's amazing.
It is. It's this rare instance where a defeated armed uprising directly leads to democratic reform. It sort of enshrined this legacy of political activism right into the state's identity.
And the ultimate legacy of that gold rush wealth was that when the Australian colonies federated in 1901, Melbourne was the logical choice to be the nation's first capital.
Ready-made. It held that honor for 26 years until the compromised city of Canberra was finally ready in 1927.
Okay, let's transition to the physical framework of the state. Its geography, climate, and some of these complex legal definitions of its borders. We have to start with this piece of legal trivia, the Northern Border Paradox.
This is one of those dry legal things that actually gives you great insight into history. The border between Victoria and New South Wales is the Murray River, but the rule is very specific. It follows the southern bank of the river.
I love that detail because it has real-world implications, right?
Absolutely. In 1980, the High Court of Australia ruled on a case about a death that happened on a river island. And the judge, Ninian Stephen, he explicitly clarified that the border follows the southern bank precisely.
So what's the consequence of that?
The consequence is that no part of the watercourse of the Murray River is actually in Victoria. If you step off the bank and put your toe in the water,
You're in New South Wales.
you're technically in New South Wales. It matters for everything: water rights, law enforcement, even fishing regulations.
Wow. Okay, and speaking of borders, Victoria also shares Australia's shortest land border.
Yep, with Tasmania. And it's not even on the mainland. It's out in the Bay Strait. And it passes through this tiny rocky outcrop called Boundary Islet for just 85 meters.
85 meters? That's almost absurd.
It's a tiny sliver of shared jurisdiction.
Moving inland, Victoria's topography is incredibly diverse for its size. You've got the Great Dividing Range, that huge mountain spine, and it sort of terminates its southern end just west of Ballarat.
And that range is responsible for shaping Victoria's climate. It gives you the Victorian Alps in the northeast, which includes the state's highest point,
Yeah.
Mount Bogong at nearly 2,000 meters.
And those areas are snow-covered in winter. They support the ski industry.
But then the state also has the complete opposite. You got extensive, flat, semi-arid plains in the west and northwest, the Mallee region. So you get temperate coasts, high alpine snow, and near-desert plains, all packed into one state.
And that diversity translates directly into some pretty wild weather patterns.
Oh yeah, it's a state of climatic contrasts. The coastal areas, especially around Melbourne, they have the mildest climate. It's moderated by the Southern Ocean. But as you push inland, especially into the Mallee, that's where you find Victoria's warmest spots, regularly over 32 degrees Celsius in summer.
And how extreme do those temperatures get?
The record high was a blistering 48.8 degrees recorded in Hopetoun back in 2009. And on the flip side, the record low was a freezing minus 11.7 degrees recorded in Omeo and Falls Creek.
And I'm guessing rainfall varies just as dramatically.
Absolutely. It generally increases as you move from south to northeast. The heaviest rainfall is in the Otway Ranges, over 1,800 millimeters a year. Contrast that with the Mallee, which gets less than 280. It makes farming out there incredibly challenging.
So if we look at human geography, the defining characteristic has to be the overwhelming dominance of Melbourne.
Melbourne is the state in so many ways. As we said, it's got about 70% of the population, around 5.2 million people. And it just dominates the economy, the media, the culture.
It makes Victoria by far Australia's most urbanized state. Nearly 90% of all residents live in cities and towns.
And governments are always talking about decentralization, but that gravitational pull of Melbourne just seems irreversible.
So what are the consequences of that, having 70% of your state in one metro area?
Well, on one hand, you have these massive efficiency gains. A centralized workforce, infrastructure, a consumer base. You see that in the high GSP. But on the other hand, it creates tremendous pressure on infrastructure, housing, transport.
In a political divide.
A huge political schism where the inner city priorities can just vastly outweigh those of the regional areas.
But despite that dominance, it's important to say that Victoria is home to 4 of Australia's 20 largest cities, so those regional centers are still substantial.
They're critical counterweights. You've got Geelong, a big port city, about 180,000 people, and then the Gold Rush cities. Ballarat, around 116,000, and Bendigo, about 103,000. They have their own identities.
And speaking of Bendigo, its central position gives it that symbolic role, right?
It's the symbolic heart. The geographic center of Victoria is just south of Bendigo, in a place called Mandarang. And Bendigo itself is known as the Heart of Gold because of that history. It's the perfect nexus point.
That brings us neatly into how those 7 million people define themselves, our deep dive into demographics and governance. Victoria's population boom is driven by both international and interstate migration.
With 35.1% of its inhabitants being immigrants, that's a huge number. And it means Victoria has this really rich, diverse ancestry profile.
So what does the 2016 census tell us?
The top nominated ancestries were English and Australian, followed by the historical waves, Irish and Scottish. But importantly, you see the modern era reflected with strong Chinese ancestry at 6.7% and Italian at 6.4%.
And when we drill down into birthplaces outside Australia, we see that global appeal.
The top birthplaces are England, India, and mainland China, all clustered around that 2.7 to 2.9% mark, followed by New Zealand and Vietnam. And if you look at language, while most people speak English at home, the top non-English languages are Mandarin, Italian, Greek, and Vietnamese.
So let's construct the average Victorian based on that census data. What does the statistical composite look like?
It paints a very specific picture. The median age is 37. The mode, sex is female, speaks English at home, is married, has 2 children.
Okay.
And crucially, this average Victorian has at least one parent who was born overseas. They live in a 3-bedroom house, which they own with a mortgage, and they own 2 cars. It really captures that stable, modern, multicultural, suburban society.
Moving on to governance, Victoria operates under the Westminster system. Its parliament is bicameral.
Right. You have the Legislative Assembly, the lower house, with 88 members, and then the Legislative Council, the upper house, with 40 members.
And that distinction in how the upper house is elected, proportional representation, that's key, isn't it?
It's absolutely key.
Yeah.
The effect is that it gives minor parties a much stronger chance of getting seats. It means the 2 major parties can't easily control the upper house, so you often get a hung council. It makes for a broader range of political voices.
Like the Greens.
Exactly. The Greens have a strong representation there, which reflects the state's diverse demographics.
And executive authority rests with the governor, who represents the king, but governance is carried out by the premier, currently Jacinta Allen of the Labour Party.
Now let's talk about the state's political identity, because it's probably its most defining modern feature. Analysts pretty much all agree Victoria is the nation's most progressive state.
And that's not just a feeling, it's backed by hard numbers from national votes.
The evidence is undeniable. Victoria recorded the highest yes votes of any state in the Republic referendum, the same-sex marriage survey, and the recent Indigenous voice referendum.
So where are the political fault lines? Does that density imbalance create a schism?
It absolutely defines the political map. The Labour Party is strongest in the working and middle-class Melbourne suburbs and in those big regional cities, Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong.
And
their support base is in the affluent, generally more conservative eastern suburbs of Melbourne. And the Greens, reflecting that progressive, educated inner-city identity, are strongest in inner Melbourne. The map is literally drawn between the dense urban core and everywhere else.
let's shift now to the economy. This is vital for understanding that shifting economy's theme, because Victoria's GSP tells a story of profound, deliberate change.
It's a powerhouse economy, no doubt. Second largest in Australia, accounts for a quarter of the nation's GDP, about $459 billion as of 2020. But the modern story is all about the rise of the service sector and the managed decline of industry.
So let's break that down. Where are Victorians actually working?
Healthcare and social services is the single biggest employer, by a long way, 12.8% of the workforce, followed by retail. But if you look at economic value, that's where Melbourne's financial strength becomes clear.
Finance and insurance.
Exactly. They lead the charge, representing 12.8% of GSP value, with professional and technical services right behind. It's a highly skilled, tertiary-driven economy now.
And that financial dominance goes right back to the gold rush, doesn't it?
It does. The historical wealth meant the infrastructure and the skilled professional class were already in place. It was the natural place for those high-value services to concentrate and eventually replace manufacturing.
But despite that shift, agriculture is still huge. Second largest agricultural producer in Australia.
It's fundamental to the state's regional identity. It employs about 67,000 people, and the output isn't just large, it's highly specialized.
Give us the specifics.
Victoria is totally dominant in pears and apples. It produces nearly 90% of all Australian pears and a third of the nation's apples. And they're leaders in vegetables like asparagus, broccoli, carrots, tomatoes.
And it's the National Center for Dairy Farming, unequivocally.
That's its agricultural core. The state is home to 60% of Australia's dairy cattle, and produces nearly two-thirds of the nation's milk. That's almost 6.4 billion liters a year. It's also a massive wool and meat producer.
There's a fascinating policy side note here about GM canola.
Yes, this speaks to that tension between science and market perception. Victoria, like the rest of Australia, put a moratorium on GM canola back in 2003 because they were worried about market rejection in Europe.
But that ban was eventually lifted.
It was in 2008, and the government estimated that adopting GM canola provided a proven financial benefit of about AUS $45 per hectare per season. It was a key decision in modernizing the farming industry.
We should also acknowledge the sector's vulnerability, which we saw sharply during the pandemic.
The supply chain disruptions had immediate and severe consequences. The sources specifically noted the impact on live seafood sales to China, which peak around Chinese New Year. When those exports stopped, the financial damage was immediate.
Okay, now for the biggest economic story, the profound decline of manufacturing. Melbourne may have been Australia's most important industrial city, but that era is definitively over.
The numbers are stark. It's not just a relative decline, it's absolute. Manufacturing share of GSP fell from over 20% in 1990 down to just 8.6% by 2016.
And actual output shrank.
Exactly. Manufacturing output peaked in 2008 and then slowly fell. And that corresponds directly to a massive job exodus. We're talking nearly 100,000 jobs lost in that short period, mostly in regional industrial centers.
Which towns bore the brunt of that?
The impact was devastating in places like Geelong, which had relied so heavily on manufacturing, and the Latrobe Valley. When you lose that many jobs, it fundamentally alters the social fabric of entire towns.
And the ultimate symbolic shock was the end of the entire Australian car industry, which was largely based in Victoria.
It was a defining moment. When Ford, Toyota, and Holden all announced their closures in the 2010s, it meant Australia would completely lose its car manufacturing industry by the end of 2017. It was a deliberate shift away from heavy industry.
So despite that, the state's energy and mineral resources are still vital.
They are. Mining employs less than 1% of the workforce, but contributes about $6 billion to GSP. And the focus is overwhelmingly on one thing.
Brown coal.
Victoria's leading mineral by far. The Latrobe Valley holds the world's largest known reserves of it. They mine about 66 million tons a year, mostly for electricity. It's historically powered the state, but it poses a huge environmental challenge for a progressive state.
And offshore, there's oil and gas, though that's also contracted.
Production peaked way back in 1985 at 450,000 barrels a day. By the mid-2000s, it had plummeted to 83,000. It's still essential, but it's a shrinking industry.
And we have to mention the fracking ban.
This is a direct response to public pressure. There was a ban on onshore gas exploration put in place in 2014, and while that was partially lifted in 2021, Victoria maintains a constitutional ban on hydraulic fracturing, or frapping.
So they literally wrote it into the Constitution.
They did. It's a clear example of the government balancing energy needs against the strong environmental concerns of the population.
And a final note on mining. Despite that incredible gold rush history, modern gold production in Victoria is almost negligible, just 1% of the national total.
It's a powerful narrative shift, isn't it? The state built on gold now relies on brains and services.
Let's transition to the institutions that define the state's culture, starting with education. Victoria's commitment to education goes way back to 1872.
That's when the state school system was made free and compulsory, a massive step for social equity. Public high schools only began in 1905.
And today, students earn the VCE. You also mentioned a vocational stream, the VCE-VM.
Yes, the vocational major. It's crucial because it links directly to vocational training in TAFE institutions, so students not aiming for university have a strong, accredited pathway into the workforce.
And the university system is enormous. 9 universities, the oldest being the University of Melbourne from 1855.
And the largest, Monash University, is staggering. It enrolls over 83,000 students, the most of any Australian university. But the real story is the international student component. It's critical to the economy.
Wait, Monash has 83,000 students, and international students make up 40% of all university enrollments across the state. That's a massive economic ecosystem.
It's a huge export industry. Those international students account for the highest percentage of prepaid tuition fees in Australia. It also makes the state highly sensitive to global travel restrictions.
But the vocational sector, TFE, has seen a less positive trend.
Indeed. Enrollment in TFE dropped by a massive 40% between 2014 and 2018. It's partly due to a crackdown on low-quality private providers, but also that societal shift towards seeing university as the superior pathway.
And briefly on libraries, the State Library Victoria is globally significant.
It's rated as the fourth most visited public library in the entire world, which just underscores Melbourne's reputation as a knowledge hub.
Let's discuss infrastructure. The road network naturally radiates out from Melbourne.
It does, but the rail system is where the historical complexity really emerges. Victoria's rail uses not one, but three different gauges.
Three.
You have the broad gauge for most of the local and regional services. Then there's the standard gauge for all interstate and freight lines, because that matches the rest of the country. And finally, two narrow gauge lines are preserved just for tourist railways.
But the truly unique transport feature of Melbourne is the tram network.
Melbourne operates the world's largest tram network. It's a critical piece of public transit, especially in the inner city, and it's a major tourist draw.
In terms of utilities, Victoria is notable for its high-quality water and its proactive management.
The water is very high quality, needs minimal chlorination. And to combat droughts, the state developed the Victorian water grid system.
What does that grid do?
It's a series of major new pipelines, like the Wimmera-Mallee pipeline, that allow water to be moved to where it's most needed across the state. It's a long-term approach to climate change adaptation.
Okay, we have to dedicate time to the state's global calling card.
Right.
Sport. Melbourne was named the world's sporting capital in 2016.
This is non-negotiable Victoria. It's the spiritual home of Australian rules football. It's practically a religion there. 10 of the 18 AFL clubs are based in the state.
And the AFL Grand Final is more than just a game.
It's a cultural touchstone. The Friday before the Grand Final is a public holiday across the whole state. The game is held at the MCG, the spiritual home of the sport.
And beyond AFL, Melbourne hosts these huge global events.
Every January, you have the Australian Open, the first Grand Slam of the year. Then there's the Formula One Grand Prix. And locally, they host the world's longest-running surfing competition, the Bells Beach Surf Classic.
Not to mention the horse racing.
The Melbourne Spring Racing Carnival is one of the biggest in the world. It centers on the Melbourne Cup, the race that stops a nation. It draws massive crowds, over 700,000 people. It's a critical social and economic fixture.
Now, we need to touch on a major recent event that speaks to the costs of that title, the 2026 Commonwealth Games.
This was a pivotal moment. Victoria was supposed to host the 2026 Games, mostly in regional cities, to boost their economies. But then the state government just abruptly withdrew the offer on July 18, 2023.
Why? What does that tell us?
The official reason was a catastrophic cost blowout. The initial estimate was around $82.6 billion, and it had ballooned to an estimated $6 billion or more.
Wow.
The withdrawal highlights a harsh economic reality. Even for a wealthy state, the immense financial burden of a major multi-sport event was deemed fiscally irresponsible. It was a shift towards pragmatic governance over cultural grandstanding.
But despite that, the commitment to professional sport is still incredibly high.
Absolutely. They've got the Melbourne Storm in the NRL, 3 teams in the A-League soccer, 2 teams in the NBL basketball. It's a truly comprehensive multi-sport professional commitment.
We have completed our journey. Time for our summary synthesis.
If we pull it all together, Victoria's identity is founded on the explosive wealth of the gold rush. That historical foundation now underpins a modern identity defined by its highly urbanized nature. With that 70% concentration in Melbourne, its unequivocally progressive politics, and a complete economic transition.
That economic shift away from heavy industry and towards high-value services and education, especially those international student fees, is the critical modern story. They basically sacrificed their car industry and replaced it with finance, healthcare, and education.
And that international focus is cemented by its diplomatic relationships. Victoria has these deep, long-term sister-state relationships in Asia.
Which ones?
2 with China, Jiangsu from way back in 1979, and Sichuan, plus vital relationships with Japan's Aichi Prefecture and South Korea's Busan. It shows their economic future is deeply entwined with the dynamism of Asia.
So, to leave you with a final thought, let's circle back to Victoria's unique political influence. Considering Melbourne was the seat of federal government until 1927, and given the state's continued ability to influence national social issues, as we saw with those high yes votes in every major referendum, what is the long-term impact of Victoria's highly urbanized, progressive political identity on Australia's national trajectory, especially with the economic challenges still facing its regional, non-Melbourne cities?
Does the progressive core of Melbourne inevitably pull the rest of the nation forward, even if it leaves some of its own regional towns behind in that transition away from manufacturing, Something for you to mull over until our next deep dive.